my very great pleasure to welcome everybody to the last Brown Bag of GSL's Brown Bag season. This year we have a very special guest, Professor Shane Green from Indiana University, who's been visiting professor of Latin American Studies with us this year. And we've been very honored to have him here teaching some very exciting new courses, including this semester a course on punk. And so it's been a real treat for our students to have new classes and a new face in Latin American Studies. And today we have a topic that crosses between a couple of our groups, Latin American Studies, and also of great interest to us in the China group. Right, so talking about topics in Cuba, China, USA, France, Peru. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Shane Green.
Thank you. Thanks. So quick round of thanks. Thanks everybody for coming. Emma for sort of suggesting I present something in the forum or the Brown Bag series. Olga for the publicity and sort of organizational efforts. Joe for setting up camera. So what I want to do, I'm actually sort of slowly trying to move towards some different projects. This is not really that. This is a kind of revisiting of a project related to a book that came out about a year ago on the sort of political history of the punk scene and the sort of underground art and music scene in Lima, Peru, in a time, sort of the time of war, basically, 1980s and 1990s. And it's a sort of revisiting of a particular image. So I'm not really going to talk about Chairman Mao so much as the image of Chairman Mao. And sort of, it's been an image that's really important for that scene and that moment for a variety of reasons, and that I've actually had kind of personal, kind of conceptual, theoretical frustrations with for a long time. I feel like I've only recently, as a result of a variety of things that I'll talk about to sort of set this up, started to kind of come to terms with how I want to interpret it. Because it's in the book, but I don't really pay that much attention to it, ironically enough, despite it being probably the most controversial, at least in terms of its political consequences, image that was produced that came out of this underground art scene that was connected to an underground music scene. So a couple of things. Also thought it's May 1st, International Workers' Day. Let's look at an image that has a bunch of raised fists in it, if you happen to know the history of that particular symbology. Turns out the particular raised fists in the image that are kind of get to the final point I want to make are specifically of women of Andean descent in particular, right? Sort of it's the kind of the deeper layers of this image that I think make it kind of interesting, that I probably have only kind of come back around to for basically in a different way, and maybe a sort of deeper way, for basically two reasons. I was asked to write something new because the guy you see here on the right, Alfredo Marquez, who is one of the two authors of this piece, one of the two artists who produced this piece, it's from 1989, is right now having a 35-year retrospective in sort of one of the more premier visible galleries in Lima. And so sort of it forced me to kind of re-engage with his work and this image in particular. And also because I think, you know, for those of us, I mean, like myself, who sort of always want to try to find the pulse of kind of politically, socially, in terms of resistance and protest, what's happening in Latin America, I think it's unquestionable that Zapatismo is over, frankly. It's not visible or as impactful as it was in the 90s and 2000s. And what for basically the last, depending on how you do the genealogy, at least the last 5 years, and probably going back toward like last 10 years, what is increasingly the most visible and most vital and most kind of crucial is the contemporary Latin American feminist movement, which kind of now, after a series of iterations, goes under this logo of Ni Una Menos. It's sort of dovetailed with Me Too more recently, obviously, but it has its own distinct genealogy, which, ironically enough, has this little girl holding the teddy bear and raising her fist. So there's this interesting kind of resonance with something that's going on in this image, which we'll eventually get to. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time, I don't know, however long it takes, to sort of set this up a little bit conceptually, and then I'm going to literally kind of do a journey where we don't stay the same amount of time in each of these different sites. To make this point about the sort of, at least for me, most productive reading of an image like this is to sort of start at the surface and move towards depth, right? And that requires, as it turns out, going on a little journey, not in following Mr. Mao himself, but the image, this very iconic, one of the most globally recognizable images actually of the 20th century, right? It's up there with the Che image and certain Elvis imagery, and in terms of how obsessively it's been reproduced and appeared in different spaces to different effect and so on. I think I finally identified that there were like three really crucial questions that were bugging me with this image that I only started to get to somewhat at the bottom of recently, one of which was like, what exactly would be the conceptual or theoretical framework that would be most useful to answer two other questions that were bugging me about this image, which were basically, how do we read this as not simply a derivative of Warhol's obsession with Mao in the 1970s, or even a just kind of localization of it, sort of Pruvianization of Warhol in his obsession with producing Maos in the 1970s. And sort of as related to that, or maybe just a different way of sort of thinking about the consequences of producing artistic imagery, why did this image produce a result that was so incredibly ambiguous that at one moment it was read by the state as terrorist propaganda, as essentially a direct affiliation with this organization called the Shining Path, which was Maoist in inspiration and affiliation. And then 4 years later, used to exonerate him and read in the exact opposite way. It's actually a sort of anarchist pop culture spoof and kind of, sort of ridicule of what is obviously one of the sort of sacred images in their particular political ideology. So it's a long story. You could spend days or weeks or whatever talking about the particularities of Shining Path and Peru's particular experience in the 80s and the 90s with the Cold War. But it's basically, one of more unique kind of insurgent, sort of leftist insurgencies that comes out of Latin America during the Cold War, late part of the Cold War period, precisely because it's Maoist in inspiration, right? Quite dogmatic, quite bloody. It's a long story, and we can get into some of that if people are interested, right? But sort of, it was those questions that sort of had me frustrated, right? And sort of only kind of felt like I've started to touch better on more recently. And I started going through a kind of list of like, what are the possible conceptual frameworks that might help me answer those questions? Definitely not a linear chronology. This is not a narrative that sort of starts at point A and proceeds toward point B. I think one could make a claim that there's a certain kind of multi-sidedness of following the thing, and particularly following Mao's image across time and space. It's not really the emphasis here. In terms of sort of globalization paradigms, there's a lot of different ones. There's at least one or two kind of critical globalization paradigms I can think of. There's also the ones that kind of sometimes bother me, sort of when we are at too high a level of theoretical abstraction that we never really get grounded anywhere. Or the ones that sort of pretend to do kind of globalization analysis, touching in different sites and times and places, and never actually convince you that they know anything in depth about any one particular time or place, right? So sort of trying to avoid those things. And it dawned on me that what was actually at stake was doing a sort of inverse reading of this, not as a Peruvian Warhol or a sort of localization of Warholian aesthetics, but the precise opposite, which is to say, if Warhol's famously coy, sarcastic, ironic, playful, almost sort of frustratingly so, if you've ever read that little book, sort of 200 pages, it was just like snarkiness chapter after chapter. The whole point, apparently, because he himself would never actually say this in a kind of serious conceptual way, was that we're going to stay at the surface, right? There's nothing other than surface, right? Which other people, because he himself would not do that, other people, of course, have taken to be a kind of critical comment that, capitalist modernity is about living on the surface, basically, right? And never actually getting to the depths. And it just sort of dawned on me that actually what's happening in this particular image is exactly the opposite of that. It's the surface that's the distraction. It's the image of Mao, actually, that is the distraction from what the artists were ultimately trying to say. So it's actually about sort of proposing to you, sort of starting at the surface and then getting past it, right, as soon as you can, to sort of ask these kind of critical questions and engage with what's happening at the deeper levels of the image and by virtue of the image in terms of what it's commenting on, what's happening in Peruvian society at this particular political moment. I forgot very briefly, in terms of just a super brief history of this particular image, it was produced in Cuba. It laid around for several years. One of the artists, the other artist, Enrique Wong, who's also from Lima, was part of this kind of little group of artists, was detained in 91, sort of tortured for about 15 days, let out. His family decided it was time to send him abroad. He went to Brazil and died in an accident a few years later. Alfredo, the guy who's in the picture here, went to prison in 1994 for originally 20 years, and then 4 years later, there was this kind of state commission that was set up to try to identify people who had been wrongly accused, and he was let out in 1998. So from 94 to 98, he spent time in prison, accused essentially of affiliation, sort of propagandizing for the Shining Path, this image being absolutely crucial, both at the time of putting him in prison and then actually getting him out. So so sort of read in completely opposite ways at different points by the state. So in terms of this sort of movement of surface to depth, sort of, the first move was to think, okay, this is not a Warhol piece. It's an anti-Warhol piece, or at least this sort of function in a certain kind of way, is to say, actually, you know what? The surface is what doesn't matter, right? The surface is what you're trying to get past to start asking questions about what's really going on at deeper levels, right? And sort of that, for me, in terms of my own kind of graduate training and sort of long-standing kind of interest in sort of social theory, immediately rang all kinds of bells of sort of these various kinds of theoretical, cultural, social, even psychoanalytic paradigms that sort of start and end kind of with that assumption of in the psychoanalytic paradigm, you start with a joke and eventually you find trauma, right? Or you start with a dream and eventually you find deep-seated trauma, right? Or in the Marxian tradition, obviously you start with a commodity and from that you unravel the entire political and economic and social relationships that are sort of being hidden in the commodity form and so on and so forth, right? Critical race, critical sort of feminist traditions do very similar sorts of thing, right? So started thinking about, what is it that has motivated me in particular to sort of think in those ways, that think about we start at the surface and move towards the depths, right? A bunch of things, yes?
What's the difference from this image, between this image and the Warhol?
We're going to get there. That's part of the journey. The journey goes quicker. I'm just sort of setting things up. I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but there are three figures that I constantly come back to in teaching, and there's specific pieces of theirs that I constantly come back to in teaching, and this is one of the first opportunities where I felt like I had a really good opportunity to put them all in dialogue. Anibal Quijano's kind of critical take on globalization theory in the early 90s, with his notion of coloniality of power, which is basically the idea that if you want to think about globalization over the long term, you have to go back to the invention of the Americas, basically, which is the moment at which Eurocentric thinking and historicizing starts to take place and develops precisely in relationship to associating the invention of particular racial categories with particular regimes of labor, right? So sort of slavery on the one side and people of African descent, and servitude in the case of indigenous people, right? And in sort of both scenarios, basically over the long haul, what happens is that Europeans become either masters and owners or patronizing bosses, right? And then sort of that gets over 500 years, get mapped out and remapped out in various kinds of ways, right? Fanon's sort of psychoanalytic side, in terms of sort of combining decolonial thinking and Marxism with kind of straightforwardly Freudian kind of framework, with the kind of crucial caveat being that we're now not just talking about sort of trauma and repetition of trauma and attempts to and often failures to resolve trauma in terms of individual bodies or minds, but collective bodies and minds, right? And then finally, sort of one of my favorite feminist pieces, Gail Rubin's The Traffic in Women, or Traffic of Women, from whatever that is, 74, 75, where she sort of takes apart each of these sort of massive, as it turns out, very masculinist paradigms, Marxist political economy, psychoanalysis, Levi-Strauss's structuralism, and says at the end of the day, across sort of time and space, modernity, pre-modernity, and so on and so forth, one of the things that you most systematically find is women being socially positioned as objects in transactions between men, right? And you sort of have to get past precisely the surface of these ostensibly very deep theoretical paradigms to realize that sex and gender is its own frame, right? Its own sort of distinct vector, if you will, of history, of oppression, sort of the way societies are politically organized and so on. Anyway, that's where this is all going, right? Because essentially this is a moment of deep, deep repetition of trauma in the Peruvian context, in the Andean context, a decolonizing moment, even if it's being delivered primarily through a Marxist and Maoist lens. And it turns out, interestingly enough, and quite distinct actually from a lot of other Latin American insurgencies, women play an absolutely crucial role, right? So that's essentially what I'm trying to suggest, that is what's really at stake and what's really kind of being grappled with in this image, which means kind of getting past Warhol, getting past the kind of Warhol and amongst other references, right? So I have this organized basically in what sort of, 15 or so minutes time remains, is a kind of journey that goes from surface, like literally scratching the surface in these certain sites and then moving towards the depths of Peru, if you will, in this particularly tumultuous moment of the 80s and 90s, to try to back at least 15% of what I just sort of said. So Cuba, all I can say is it was actually produced in Havana in 1989, this particular image by two Peruvian artists from this collective called The Workshop of the Unidentified. It's kind of its own kind of telling name in terms of the political moment that they were producing art in. They were invited, they went. They were a pretty marginal part of the activities, frankly. They were sort of involved largely in a kind of peripheral silk screening workshop, and they produced, amongst a couple of other things, this image, a few copies of this particular image, the official title of which was Viva el Maoismo, Long Live Maoism. And then we're back to Peru. Not a whole lot that I actually think could really be said about its life in Cuba, other than the fact that Mao doesn't resonate in Cuba the way he does in Peru, for example, right? And frankly, just later, I mean, I think a number of copies probably left around. They even did some T-shirts. The most interesting thing I've seen is like a couple of their old Cuban buddies, like more recently, sending pictures to Alfredo, the one artist who's still alive, who's had the sort of gone on to have this artistic career. It's like, dude, I still have the T-shirt. Having recognized that in Peru and other spaces of Latin America, he's become kind of a prominent, visible figure. If we go to China, and then here, this is by far the place and time and history that I'm by far the least familiar with. But just think of this as like, so if that's the literal physical image that was produced in Havana, Cuba, this is the one symbolic element that's repeated across these various works that I'm going to talk about, right, that are being referenced here. The one constant, if you sort of aesthetic or symbolic constant. And it was funny to me that being a complete non-expert, like almost knowing nothing really about sort of the history of China one way or the other, how quickly, if you just like do a Google search, you immediately discover that there's a tremendous amount of complexity in the history of this very iconic global image. And so I'm drawing on really just 2 or 3 kind of most journalistic kind of sources. There's a really interesting piece by a recent Harvard grad, Fei Zhang, about the sort of contemporary history of this Mao image. And in part, maybe not surprisingly in terms of the way sort of state politics works, and iconic political celebrity works, it's a lot of it is about the erasure of ambiguity in reference precisely to his body. So there's machinations and sort of pre-Photoshop machinations and manipulations involved in the construction of this image. And by far, there's a lot of different things or a handful of things I've read about. The one that sort of most struck me that a couple of these pieces cite is that in some moment, at least from outside of China, at least in my particular case as a non-expert, I didn't know that there was a sort of series of about 4 or 5 different images, all constructed very similarly over the late 40s to the late 1950s in a very similar position, that produced this seemingly singular kind of image, first of all, and that at a certain strategic point, I don't know when exactly this happened, but a couple of them mentioned this, it was no longer allowable to show him showing only one ear. He had to be showing both ears because he has to be listening fully, right, to the people. This is what I mean by sort of like the production of a kind of erasure of ambiguity, whereas, the other artists that I'm talking about are all about trying to introduce ambiguity, different kinds of ambiguity into the image of Mao, right, which is also an image of at least a crucial part of his body, right? Okay, so if we move more, what I would say less, instead of sort of like one site, but as a kind of interesting kind of dual site, a dialogue or an exchange taking place between the US and France, specifically New York and Paris. There are basically 2 important figures here, right, and one of which is often, not in general artistic terms, but in reference to this specific imagery, the use of the image of Mao, often overlooked. And there's kind of 2 crucial points I want to make here about this sort of Warhol's own obsession with the image of Mao, which started in basically 72 and 73, and the way that that's produced an erasure that he was actually referring to and presumably directly inspired by a Dali Halsman composite that was made originally in 67 and then first kind of made more public in the French version of Vogue, the cover of the French version of Vogue in 1971 when Dali was asked to sort of put together some sort of cover art, right? He sort of decided to use that image. Dali himself went through a period in the late 60s and early 70s where he himself was also obsessed, fascinated with the images of Mao and Marilyn Monroe. So from what we know, kind of obviously from the Warhol rendition of this is that, this is like his standard signature kind of style, done with Elvis, done with Marilyn Monroe prior to this in the 1960s, famously he was not actually the author of the Che version of this, but took credit for it anyway. There's a lot of stories there. It's his signature style, right? But there's this kind of hidden predecessor, if you will, that is being referenced in it and directly inspired it. which is a literal, right, rather than a kind of figurative or metaphorical gender blending of Mao in a kind of more feminine register, a much more explicit photo composite that Dali charged this New York-based photographer Philip Halsman with doing. Like, I want to see what it looks like when Mao and Marilyn Monroe's faces are literally put together, right? Which is sort of where that idea comes from, and what made Warhol think that would be an interesting thing to play with, since he had already played with the image of Monroe. Lots of things to say there. Beyond that, the second perhaps interesting thing is like how one decides to read this and at what point in time, right? So sort of often the first go-to, at least in terms of what I read, gesture is like, oh, this is a comment about East versus West, right? Sort of like communism, collectivism, sort of political iconicity versus individualism, markets, superficiality of commodities, pop culture, celebrity, like those are the things kind of at play, and obviously partly that's one way to read them. The other and more sort of, in some ways, more interesting way to read them is what exactly is or is not being said, or sort of how celebratory versus not a take on transgender and queerness one might want to do, particularly at this particular stage of the game. It's probably not; those are not terms necessarily that have been operative at the time that these images were first circulating. And I think one could go either way. And there's certain ways in which to kind of reread this. Warhol was obviously openly gay. The New York scene was very sort of open to various kinds of dissident sexualities and gender types. On the flip side, Dali was famously possibly closeted gay and famously phobic of sexuality, which is ironic given his images, and possibly deeply misogynistic, right? And sort of more interested in voyeurism than actual engagement of any particular kind, right, with women sexually. There's a lot of overlap with decay and death in reference to and in dialogue with women's bodies, actually, in a lot of his work, right? So, how much you want to celebrate versus be skeptical, it depends on how you think about the actual biographies of these folks, right? And, for his celebratoriness on the sort of sexual dissidence front, Warhol was famously a clubbist, right? Like he was a gatekeeper, right? And became the object of tremendous ire and resentment, including very vitriol kind of ire and resentment of people like Valerie Solanas, for example, right? Of sort of being really, really careful about who got in the club and who didn't, and that being as important as probably anything else, like talent, for what saw the light of day. There's a really great book called The Warhol Economy that came out not too long ago, and sort of that's one of the crucial points, sort of crucial to setting up the idea that what makes things economically viable or artistically viable or even have visibility is like whether you know the right guy or person who's running the club, basically, right? Okay, so spend a little bit more time in Peru to try to substantiate this as an anti-Warhol piece, and a piece that has a lot more to say about a sort of decolonial moment and a very tumultuous moment and sort of reacting and rethinking gender in the Peruvian and Andean context. First of all, so I have 4 points here instead of like 1 or 2 for the other places and images of Mao. First, important to recognize that, hey, what's up? Important to recognize that this was not a lone wolf figure of like one instance of artistic rendering of Mao. On the right, you see standard shining path sort of leftist propaganda where Mao's images are obviously being invoked as the primary ideological inspiration for the movement. On the one hand, fairly straightforward kind of Soviet realist portrayal. On the left, you have a bunch of different representations, and there were quite a few of these, of punks, some musicians, people doing fanzines, people doing underground art at the time in the 80s and turn of the 90s, appropriating Mao's image and doing these more kind of like, as object of ridicule or caricature or cartoonism and, so on and so forth, right? So sort of this one piece that I'm talking about was not alone in the sort of broader aesthetic field. It was part of an artistic and political dialogue that was taking place. That still doesn't answer the question about why this particular one got a guy put in prison and then released 4 years later, right? So if we go to the second point that I want to make, Notice the two, finally, the big reveal, the two crucial elements here that are actually either literally behind Mao's image or kind of footnoted to it. The barcode, it's really blurry when you blow it up, but 24953 was the number of the legislation that was used to prosecute people for apology for terrorism. So ironically enough, and in a barcode fashion, right, sort of clearly ironic reference to capital, state, all these kinds of things. Commercialization of bodies versus repression of bodies, all those kinds of things. That was precisely the legislation under which Alfredo, one of the two artists, went to jail under, right? And then got out 4 years later. More crucially, perhaps the other key ingredient here, and the other reason that people from a distance, not kind of getting to the depth, read this as a Warhol piece, is that thing that's being repeated, the image that's being repeated in the background from a distance looks like soup cans, right? There's a soup can effect. What it actually is a clandestine photo of female Shining Path prisoners still in prison. They're in Canto Grande prison at this point in the late 80s with fist raised, right? And one of many sort of acts of, it's a long story, but Shining Path by the mid-80s had declared that prisons were the third most important site of combat. Actually, you don't just go to prison and stop. You reorganize from within the prison. There were lots of revolts and sort of takeovers of prisons, which was actually pretty easy to do because there's basically no internal control in prisons and so on and so forth. This is a photo that was sort of smuggled out and published in a very most left-leaning periodical at the time, showing all women militants. And I know for a fact that is not an accident, because there are plenty of other photos you could get of male militants or co-ed or whatever you want. It's not an accident to choose that particular image to repeat and give the effect of, if you look at this from a distance, it's a reference to Warhol's soup cans. Right? Okay, so third, so that's the second. Notice the two key ingredients that are literally or figuratively behind or to the side, right, to marginalized by what's in the middle. The third, and this idea is partly inspired by one other reading that's a little bit more interesting than some of the other readings of this piece, is to contemplate the possibility that we're not looking at Mao at all, right? What we're actually looking at is a stand-in for Abel Guzman, the leader. Abel Guzman, the leader of the Shining Path, right? A symbolic stand-in, and that what's being ridiculed and made fun of in a Warholian fashion is not Mao, but Guzman. Insofar as these guys were anarchists, right? They were punks. The last thing they wanted to do was become part of the Central Committee that was going to become part of a one-party state, right? They weren't idiots, right? In that sense, and their political affiliations did not go in that direction, right? So there's a sort of ridicule here that might be happening indirectly, not so much towards Mao in terms of no, this guy who claims he's the Mao of the Andes, which is literally what Guzman did. He claimed himself to be the fourth sword after sort of Marx, Lenin, and Mao. It's now me, basically, right? So that's interesting. And then the sort of fourth and I guess last thing I'll say about this piece before I kind of conclude and shut up is that, again, not accidental that the image being repeated over and over and over and over again, not just in the background, but if you notice, so I have the circle here, literally in the body. And they're using they're doing sort of hybrids of photocopies here. It's interesting, right? We talk about the importance of photocopy technology if you want to this particular art scene. Literally sort of re-inscribed, semiotically re-inscribed within the body of Mao, who's possibly Guzman, are actually women's bodies of Andean descent with fists held high, right? Which begs the question, well, so what possibly are we trying to grapple with in that gesture, right? In that sort of gesture where they don't have the iconicity of a Mao or a Guzman, but they're actually way more present. There's a lot more of them, right? They're sort of what's actually making things happen, as it turns out, right? And so there you have to do sort of take stock of a variety of things, but probably the most important of which is that the Shining Path, whatever else it was, dogmatic, hard leftist, very clunky and very brutal and very grotesque in a lot of different kinds of ways, it was also a moment in which possibly at no other prior point in Andean history, women of Andean descent stood up in a way they frankly haven't, ever, right? Until perhaps more recently when you see these really mass mobilizations of Latin American women in the streets, not only in the Andes, but also in Andean countries. And what I mean by that is it's a long story. There's a variety of levels. Shining Path is one of the few Latin American guerrilla insurgencies that had women at every level of the leadership. The sort of top party structure, central party structure, was about 18 people. 9 of them were women. The number 2 was always a woman. Yes, you could still make the argument it's true that it was a very kind of patriarchally inclined atmosphere with Guzman at the top, right? And it was always his wife, his first wife, and then his second wife as number 2. But there was a sort of an attention to that at the highest levels and at the lower levels, which is to say, at one point they sort of estimated that in their cell structure, their insurgent cell structure, at least 40 to 50% of the militants themselves were women. And that a lot of those cells, I don't know how many, but a lot of those cells were run by women, actually. So much so that, for example, one of the sort of it became denigrating over time ways to refer to Shining Path subversives in the Peruvian context is sacos, which comes from this notion of saco largo, which I'm just going to say it is basically the Spanish way to say pussy whipped, which is to say sort of dominated, somebody else being dominated by women, right? So sort of from the top levels of the structure to the sort of more kind of field level of the insurgency, women were, for better and worse, right, making a lot of decisions. And crucially involved in decision-making structure. And I guess what I'll close with is that rather than rereading this as a kind of feminist form of militancy, because I would read it as a feminine form of militancy, right? And a sort of an attention to, a struggle with, a grappling with the traumas of being literally the most subaltern, folks on the scale in Andean societies, women of Andean descent. And trying to grapple with that position by sort of asserting themselves and putting their bodies in really radical ways in danger. And I say feminine over feminist for a very particular, precise reason. When it came time, and it did come time at multiple points, for the Shining Path to sort of ideologically state its position on feminism, it kind of fell back, not surprisingly, into a kind of clunky, traditional leftist critique of gender problems will get resolved by simply getting more women involved and resolving problems of production and class and material relationships, right? Sort of just naturally get resolved. But what was always the case from even before they started militant actions in the night and sort of organizing ideologically and sort of in study groups and meetings in the 1970s was that they always had a feminine wing of the party. It was called the Movimiento Femenino Popular, and they sort of were theorizing the whole way they were going from the perspective of what specifically is going to be the role of women in this process, right? So that, had these impacts of sort of putting them in leadership positions, putting them in the position of militants for the logistical support, and so on and so forth, and requesting of them that they use their bodies in very radical ways. So I think I'll leave it at that. Let's see if people have questions. Yes?
Yeah. Many rich materials. I'm trying to sort of figure out who were doing the reading, who were the readers, because it seems that who were reading the image is less important, if not more important,
Absolutely, yeah.
than what is being read, right? So, you went really fast, so I'm just
Yeah.
trying to...
Sorry, I do that.
to make sure that I understood who the readers were.
Of the image.
Of the image,
Yeah.
yeah. And there were the state readers.
Right.
They are not that fascinating.
Yeah.
But then there were
And yet they have
many
such dramatic
other
consequences.
readers. So am I understanding you correctly that one of the readers is very sympathetic to the Shining Path activism, ideology, whatever. So anyway, I'd like you to sort of give us a rundown of who was reading the 1, 2, 3, 4 images, so that I will.
In terms of the elements to take account of.
Yeah, who were they? Not exactly the names, but the logical affiliation. So I'd like to know. I think you gave us many readings.
Yes.
So I'd like to know who was behind each reading.
Okay.
So that I can then probably ask more intelligent questions. That's my first.
Right. Well, I will say I don't know that there has been a feminist reading of this image. So I guess I'll take credit for that. I mean, to my knowledge, right, a very explicitly kind of feminist, or even feminine for that matter, reading of this image. In part because I feel like a lot of the Peruvian art criticism and sort of intellectual community that has taken account of this image just tries to do something Warhol-y with it, with it mostly, right? Sort of, it's an argument about localization or Peruvianization or cholification or in some sort of more gender-neutral sense. And so maybe I'll take a little bit of credit for that. And I'm not credit only in the sense that like I'm trying to suggest that part of what helped me get there was, over the past couple of years, witnessing the dramatic, visible emergence of a contemporary feminist movement that's in the streets. Like it's not just NGOs and activism, like it's in the streets, right? And that I think has kind of helped me want to go in that direction, right? In terms of other readings that have been done, it's often of the Warhol sorts. There's this sort of what I would call the suspicious readings. There are a lot, to this day, very remaining open questions, people who want to know more about what Alfredo, Enrique Wong is dead. He's been dead since the 90s. So can't ask questions of him, right? But there are people who want Alfredo to actually admit that he was involved in militancy. I know certain things about certain people, right, that I do or do not reveal, but like I will say that in general, the pattern that I found in the book of people who came out of the music scene and the art scene who had sort of anarchism as their principal kind of ideological and political inspiration, thought the Shining Path shared a similar goal, which was to destroy the state. But they're anarchists, right? So their utopian dream was to see, hypothetically imagine a future in which the state doesn't exist, in which concentrated forms of authority and power no longer exist, right? So they were some of the first, really, to be critical of this, central party structure that was not only going to, if it had been victorious, if the Shining Path had won, the anarchists would have been on the first on the list to get rid of, right? Any dissidents and they were very much aware of that. So if in fact some of them did actually, some of the people that came out of that scene started engaging in certain kinds of militancy, it was not in support of Shining Path. It was kind of parallel or on a different track. And that's frankly a kind of also a hidden part of the conflict, because people kind of go left, right, in the way that they read the war. In other words, there's a reading that sort of says, no, it really is, it really is still militant propaganda at some level. Maybe not the kind you think, but it's militant in some fashion. Sorry, I don't know if that helped, but. Also just important, like for years it just sat around, like you got him put in prison, but like nobody was talking about this image in the 90s. It got him put in prison and out, but nobody was talking about it until probably last 10 years, frankly.
Sorry, do you mind if I ask, I have to go in 4 minutes, but quick question, could you elaborate a little bit more about why he was let out?
Yes, ironically, and we wouldn't even know, like neither he or I would know some of these things had I not tried to get him a visa, which was of course denied. When my book was launched, we were trying to get him and another person from this art collective to come install a different work that they did as part of some book release activities. I was able to get a visa or help get a visa for the other guy who doesn't have quite the same stained record. Alfredo has actually not even been answered. Not only has he not been denied, they just haven't responded to the request. The question was, how he got out. Yeah. In the process of trying to get the visa, one of the things, new documentation came out, interestingly enough. And a crucial piece of documentation was a report that was filed when he was let out in 98 that said very specifically, like, the state got this wrong. Like, look at the image. He's making fun of Mao, which is one of the most sacred symbols in the Shining Path Maoist repertoire. He's ridiculing it. He's being irreverent towards it. Hey guys, he's a pop artist. That was like the explicit argument that was made, right? Curiously enough, not only did they say that, they said also he's more of an anarchist, which I thought was kind of, and that that's not dangerous somehow in the same way. Which, frankly, in practical, militarily term, like it wasn't as dangerous because they weren't ever going to take the state. The anarchists weren't. But yeah, the state at that point made a very specific opposite reading that, like, oh, he's just a crazy artist and we need to let him out.
Yeah, fascinating.
So I'm curious. So I've had a similar experience of being stumped by an image, or being like, okay, there's something here, and I don't know what to do with it. So actually, I want to hear a little bit more about what you did with it at first. So what was it that was sort of unsatisfying about your initial reading of it, and how did you sort of? I mean, you've touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear a bit more about how you kind of.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely more or less, because I felt a little frustrated even when I was factoring this into the book. Like, oh, I'm just doing the Warhol move here. Like, and just saying whatever. This is like a localization of Warhol imagery, and like it had this particular political resonance and so on and so forth. Partly was a function of the fact that I spent a lot of time in one particular chapter taking apart some of their prior work, this thing called the Black Folder that this same art collective had done. Like, it occupies a big chunk of an entire chapter, and it also has a picture of Mao, but not this picture of Mao in it, a previous rendition of Mao. And so part of it was just like being sort of distracted or occupied with other imagery, and part of it was just like I don't think I knew what to say, But the book had to come out, right? I had to get done with it. And the things that shifted are literally, like, I don't know if I would have ever revisited it in quite this way if, like, the things I started with didn't happen. Like, I wasn't a scholar of social movements in Latin America and constantly trying to think of this big question of, like, what is the social movement that's occupying space, and, it's both symbolic and physical and political space. And it's the feminist movement. Which is not NGO-y. I mean, it is also, like every movement has its NGO-y end of it, but it's very street-based. It has been over the last several years, with some of the largest like street manifestations in the history of Latin America in certain countries, including Peru. And so sort of thinking about bodies in space sort of started making me want to kind of come back to that question, like, what is the deal with that image? Like, I knew that was the image behind it. I just didn't know what I wanted to say about it, or like where to go with it. And so it sort of struck me as like a really important, at least in the Andean context, precedent to, like, insurgent women's bodies, basically, right? In this particular case, a very distinct ethnic background. And sort of started there. And then Alfredo said, "Hey, dude, will you write a thing for me?" And that forced me to put some words to paper or whatever, more systematic way. But I think without Ni Una Menos, I don't know if I would have really gotten quite to that reading. And I mean, one of arguably still, like, which has been a long-standing problem in Latin American feminism, like, it's still mostly run and directed by metropolitan, capital center, tending to be white and whiter and educated women for the most part, right? So this sort of stands also in tension with precisely that, because the 40% roughly of Shining Path militants and leaders were of more or less direct Andean extraction, right? So maybe one or two generations removed from a peasant background in most cases.
I took Jing's question a little differently. I was wondering, sort of, also, maybe, I guess that's what I was thinking. I'm not sure if this is what you're asking or not, but who was looking at this image, right? I mean, who saw the image, and in sort of what context?
Okay, so there's like the short and the long version. The short version is basically produced in Cuba. Nobody except people in the silkscreening workshop probably saw it. A couple people took T-shirts home because they also did T-shirts, and then they took some copies back to Peru. And honestly, I think for the next few years, the only people that would have seen it are a tiny in-group of like punks and artists and musicians who like showed up at Alfredo's or Enrique's taller workshop, and it happened to be laying around. Like, oh, that's cool. A couple of actual dialogues that they had with Shining Path supporters about the image that I've talked to them a little bit about, just little encuentros, little moments of encounter. Like, you were in Peruvian society. It didn't take more than like 1 or 2 degrees of separation to find a militant, at least at the time that this was produced, late 80s and early 90s. Particularly if you're in an art scene, sort of those sectors of left-leaning sectors of society. There were a few encounters, and interestingly enough, nothing registered, obviously, but in terms of sort of oral history, pretty routinely the Shining Path, people who were devout kind of Shining Path members' reactions was, that's bougie artsy bullshit. Basically, it was like, It's more just like distraction. It's actually a distraction from the imperative, which is armed struggle, right? And so that's interesting because the state reads it as shining path propaganda, and people who are actually members or sort of participating were like, nope, not. But for the longest time, it was like, we're talking about a handful of people who probably would have seen it until Alfredo gets detained. They take him back to his workshop, plant a bunch of evidence, like explosive packaging, as if you're going to leave that laying around, right? If you're actually an insurgent. And then they pick up a couple of pieces of art, primarily this one, and say, you see? And so that's when it becomes, this is 94, right? That's when it kind of becomes part of the state's reading. And then it died. He was in prison for several years, and then it died. And then I would say it's only been in the last 10 years that it kind of resurfaced as an object of critique, thought, intellectually, artistically. He now, frankly, sells, derivatives of this for like $5,000 a pop. Welcome to superficiality.
Yeah, I think you were guessing my subtext quite correctly. So I was assuming that you are one reader, that there are other readers in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So I'm actually very curious about those other readers' readings.
Okay.
Did you incorporate some of those readings into your reading?
Yeah, a few.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get
Yeah, a few. So there's a couple in particular that are worth mentioning. There's some, very short, somewhat perfunctory readings, and there's like a couple of theses that have been written about not only this particular work, but this particular art collective, right, and sort of their broader works. There's a fairly well-known sort of Peruvian art critic, Milko Laur, who wrote a piece that's basically journalistic, but it's interesting because it's sort of one of the things I was referencing. It gives this idea that maybe that's not Mao. That's Guzman. It's a substitution. That's what's happening, right? So that was an important, I think, reading. It's fairly short, though. In terms of a kind of deeper reading of not just this image, but the broader repertoire of this art outfit collective, all of whom had very troubling and complicated fates, right? They died, they disappeared, they left, they went into prison. They weren't the only ones, but they became a target in the early 90s, a very sort of concentrated target of state attention. And in this sense, there's a kind of interesting kind of parallel evolution, because I didn't meet this guy. He's an anthropologist, actually, trained at La Católica in Lima, who wrote a really interesting thesis, really focused on this particular art collective. And we kind of came to similar conclusions about their broader repertoire of work, which is sort of proving the point that symbolic ambiguity, aesthetic ambiguity, can become very dangerous, right? So in other words, sort of like these were artists who were operating in a political and ideological context in which you had to be for or against. And the position that they were suggesting was not for or against. It's like, let's ask the question of what's happening in our moment, basically, right? Without sort of saying for or against.
Was there a way to figure out why the state flipped its earlier interpretation?
I mean, there's luck. There's all kinds of things. I mean, but there's also the specific history of. I mean, it's also a different sector of the state, right? Let's not homogenize the state, right? The people who detained him were obviously intelligence police, but anti-terrorist intelligence police. It's a long, very sordid history about what happened, obviously, to him and people around him when he was detained. You can imagine what happened, but it's not nice. At that particular time, this is 94, it's 2 years after Guzman and the leadership was captured. Fujimori has already gone through the sort of dissolving of Congress and sort of no more pretenses towards democracy. This is an authoritarian state. And they've now captured the leadership, so the organization starts to crumble in various, Shining Path starts to crumble in various kinds of ways. And there's a very concerted attempt to do a witch hunt, to sort of remove all the remaining possible subversive elements. And so Alfredo is trapped up in that initially. And we have long interviews where it's painful description of being sent to a military tribunal. These are not civil courts. Off to the military tribunal, you're behind a one-way mirror, it's distorted sound. You can't actually understand what the judges are saying to you because it's through distorted speakers. You have literally no defense. You don't get to present a defense, right? So that's the initial process. Extremely authoritarian, right? On the flip side, at some bizarre point in the Fujimori regime, I think it starts in 95 or 6, maybe, a particular Catholic priest convinces certain members of a now reconstituted kind of faux Congress to allow him to set up a commission with this precise purpose of trying to identify people wrongly accused, right? With state, and not only state, but executive.
Well, in a way, the second interpretation by the state serves to trivialize the dissident.
Yeah, right. And in some ways that's necessary to get him out, right?
That's the strategy that the Chinese government does quite often.
Really? It's not really important. Don't pay attention to that,
just anarchist.
Yeah.
Another dangerous, rebellious militant, which pose more threat to the state.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, I think a very similar kind of, which, the good of that is he got out, right? The bad of it is, in fact, that like maybe there was more more going on in this image and in that particular, person.
Mythologizing.
Yeah, exactly.
I was teaching during most of the talk, so apologies if this makes no sense. But just responding to the part I caught, I was really curious. So I was living in Nepal during the Maoist sort of rebellion there, which was much later in the early 2000s.
Right.
And they called themselves Maoists, but there was a complete absence of Mao's face.
Oh, really?
So I was curious if there's a history to that, why that image sort of disappeared, and it might just be a local context thing. But the other thing that you mentioned is sort of feminine versus feminist question. And there, the Maoist soldiers, I think it was a similar percentage that was female, but it was often said because for those soldiers leaving their previous life behind in the village and then becoming a soldier, everyone knew there was no going back to their earlier life. So there was a sense that made them sort of even fiercer soldiers and more frightening for the opposition. So I was curious if there's a similar dynamic at work here, precisely because they were at the lowest point in the social hierarchy, that made them sort of a certain kind of soldier.
Right. No, that's a great question. I mean, I don't honestly know enough about the sort of Nepal experience with Mao. I mean, other than like vague references to it, I certainly don't know the question of like why the figure or the image of Mao wasn't a big part of that. So I can't answer that. It's a curious question though. A similar kind of thing, I mean, I think the people who have really, really dug deeply into sort of specifically who was this movement, who were the founders of it, how did it initially get started before it kind of starts taking on a life of its own and expanding to other parts of the country, sort of enveloped most of the country by the turn of the 90s. One of the interesting things, and this maybe qualifies a little bit this notion of sort of people, women of Andean descent at the absolute bottom of Andean societies. They were specifically not just, people of Andean descent, many of them women. Most of them, at least the initial organizers, had at least secondary or some post-secondary training, right? So they were, interestingly enough, like sort of one generation removed from actual peasants, like actual living in the countryside, but they were from those families, right? So sort of, rather than that being part of the process, they're already sort of kind of out of the nest in that way. And many of them were being exposed to Marxism and, sort of Guzman's particular spin on Marxism in the context of, provincial university classes, sort of technical institutes, even at the high school level in Ayacucho, in the sort of southern Andean province where the movement got started. In sort of demographic terms, they sort of already had one foot out of a peasant, a strictly speaking kind of peasant background. But that also meant, curiously enough, that they were sort of speaking on behalf of peasants, broadly speaking, who by this point in Peruvian and Andean history are not the majority of the population. Right? Sort of like most population is now urban, right, and para-urban and so on and so forth, right? And one of the explanations for why they were so angry and why they were so filled with resentment was not simply about historical trauma and race and so on and so forth, specifically about the fact that they had now gotten access to those things which most clearly represent social mobility, education, and ideas, and there was absolutely no structure for employment waiting for them. Kind of like our moment now, in a different way, right? Sort of like they're, decent job with a decent wage, equivalent to or responding to the education level that you have now achieved compared to your parents or your grandparents is not available to you. So there's deep, deep frustration and kind of quote unquote nothing else to do than to think about overthrowing the whole the whole system. Great questions. I don't know, we're maybe out of time. But I'm happy to.
A very good question about just artists as dangerous. I mean, kind of piggybacking off of your question, Jim, about the extent to which, like, I know nothing at all about this, but sort of how artists were perceived in this context. It sounds like there was a way that they could be they could be seen as terrorists in this moment, and then later it was like he's just a crazy artist, right? So what was the like how the
well, it's fun. Well, actually, now that you ask me that, it kind of brings me back to another kind of reader that existed. Like, for example, something as simple as the way the invite got constructed from they go to Cuba in 1989 to be part of the third biennial sort of Latin American art.
Who were they?
Alfredo and the guy who died, right? Enrique Wong, who's of Chinese descent. The Wong family is actually very powerful in Peru. They own supermarkets now. Anyway, they had a couple of, they've always had, I mean, it became more important for Alfredo to get recognition later on, decades later, but like, they always had these one or two people in the kind of official art sphere, because they were punks and they went to rock concerts and they dressed crappy and had long hair or weird haircuts. Like, nobody in the academic world. Peru has a very conservative kind of academic scene, and even the official arts scene is very conservative in a lot of ways. They were kind of outcasts from that whole scene. There's always like one or two people who are like, I wonder if those guys are up to something interesting, right? Or something radical, or something whatever. And the one or two moments at which those connections, minimal connections, were explored as possibilities for trying to get some of their work made visible at the time in the late 80s, they were shut down. So, for example, they not this image, but they submitted another image, which is actually an image of Guzman, and I think it was 88, to this lefty intellectual journal, magazine called Márgenes, and the editors, who are just like kind of like us, the sort of intellectuals who are lefties who don't necessarily want to get their hands or feet dirty in militant action. Said, yeah, that's a little too edgy for us. And it was a similar sort of thing. It was sort of Guzman, one of the few images. The other reason this is possibly a substitute for Guzman is like there's only like two images anybody had access to of this guy in the 80s. Like, he was underground starting in 1979, basically, right? There were no images to use of Guzman. And they had one of the few images from when he was arrested in the late 70s, or maybe, like late 70s. Where he looks really kind of grotesque, like he's kind of big, and he's got too much beard going on, and there was all this kind of crazy kind of collage aesthetics going on in the image, and it got shut down by the kind of one or two contacts they had in the kind of official art world, lefty art world. So for the longest time, they were just treated as weirdos, outcasts, until one of them in particular got caught up in the sort of state machinations, and over time that became a reason to rethink who these people were. Nobody had written anything about the art or this underground music or art scene until probably the last 7 or 8 years. Like, it just, in terms of trying to analyze it, right? It's just like this weird thing that happened that nobody...
I have an idea. So what would happen if this image traveled back to that itinerary? I think it would be interesting. It would be interesting when
the world would explode.
Now I'm just curious about the French reading of this image.
Yeah.
US,
Oh, that's great.
The Chinese vis-a-vis Cuba.
That's an excellent question. I would love to see that happen. I don't know that Alfredo or this image's visibility is enough to allow that to happen. Yeah. There's people like me, there's a couple other people in the States at least who are interested in these artists. Oh, it's already online. It's online. Yeah, of course.
Well, then
totally.
You need to find some influencers.
Yeah, I need a Warhol somewhere. I need a
word of mouth. Yeah, the, the digitally enabled word of mouth.
Yes, yeah.
No, it would be very interesting. really,
Yeah.
to make it travel back.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think in the fall when we had coffee, we were talking about this a little bit. I would love to know, like, what,
Yeah.
you know, in China, what this would do, right? Like, if
Well,
anything,
people,
right?
People would probably say, well, this is Andy Warhol.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, yeah.
There's more going on. There's a lot, turns out there's a lot more going on.
Yeah. Well, in China, you would get non-elite readers of this.
Okay.
Because you see, that's part of my first question, is driving it.
Okay.
So I was wondering if this is an elitist interpretation, what would the public think?
Right,
But
right.
obviously, you said the circulation of this image was very limited.
It was very restricted, yeah.
But
Very restricted. I
traveling
mean, there's a lot of people in that
could
scene at
open
the
up,
time who suspected
the
that. Oh,
interpretive space. Yeah.
right.
I'm interested in the larger interpretive space.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's you know, he's now become more visible, but like at the time, there was a lot of people who thought that this workshop, this any workshop that he was part of, was basically a militant cell of some sort. But you know, you don't just openly talk about these things, and, you know, in Peru or even outside of it, frankly. So.
After you're done with that article, I find somebody to translate this into Chinese.
Ooh, that would be awesome.
And then-
That would be
and then
awesome.
that would be an entry point.
Ooh, that would be
to
awesome.
China.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Seriously.
Okay. Cool. I might take you up on that. First time I've ever been, you know, written anything, you know, had something represented in Chinese.
Oh yeah, I think they will be very interested, especially the people on the left.
Yeah,
the near
yeah.
left.
Right,
They
right,
have a large following too.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
How widely disseminated was the Shining Path prisoner photo?
Oh, not at all. I mean, that's its own complicated can of worms. But this was, as it says there, published in El Diario, 1988. It was smuggled out of prison. It was a clandestine photo smuggled out of prison. It was published in what was the leftist-leaning, by most accounts, pro-Shining Path newspaper at the time, which was shut down in 91, 92 when Fujimori decided to invade all university campuses with military, close all the left-leaning press, destroy all the archives, just like sort of sweepstakes.
So using that photo in this image was highly subversive.
Oh yes, yeah. No, I mean it was, having something as simple as that, like in your pocket, in your house, in your car, whatever, would get you immediately detained. And by the early '90s, 20 years. Hey, how's 20 years sound? For something as simple as an image. So, take care. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.